Hello and welcome to this Ranorex Troubleshooting webinar. My name is Aaron Stearns and I'm a solutions engineer with Ranorex. In this presentation, we're going to be taking a look at some common issues that newer users may encounter when trying out Ranorex for the first time or a short while into their testing experience with Ranorex. We have a couple of examples that I'd like to go through. I'm not going to rely too much on slides in this presentation. We're going to be looking mostly at Ranorex Studio itself, and I have a couple of different examples that we'll be digging into and seeing just how we can understand the problem that we were facing and how to troubleshoot and how to correct that problem. So these common issues that we see here are recorder actions, and these actions are actions that you create using the Ranorex Recorder. And then playback, in the example of playback, you might have playback that is working correctly, which means that after you've recorded or created your test, you can play it back. However, some or all of the elements might be getting recognized slowly instead of just a few seconds of element recognition per item. You're talking more than 15 or 30 seconds. So we're going to take a look at how to address that. In the next case, your test might be failing at a certain point. Let's say you've recorded a test, you've created a test in Ranorex, and when you go to play it back, a number of the actions work correctly up until a certain point, and it seems that the test always fails at that certain point. This is a common issue that some users may encounter, and we're going to take a look at how to troubleshoot that, how to find what point it is exactly that the test is failing on, and how we can address that and we can fix that single point or those couple of actions to get the test working correctly from then on. In the final case, we're going to take a look at some examples of the mouse clicking maybe in the wrong place or on the wrong element. So this is something that commonly will happen if you, and depending on the application, but let's say you're testing an application that has multiple close buttons in the UI, or you have multiple elements in the UI, like multiple fields or buttons or things that you're clicking on that are very similar in some way. So we'll see how to distinguish between multiple elements and how to troubleshoot that type of error if we're seeing that. So we'll jump out of the slides right here and we'll go right into Ranorex Studio. So for those of you newer users who at this point maybe have only tried out Ranorex a little bit, this will still look familiar. For the more intermediate level users, this will be very familiar. What we're looking at here in Ranorex Studio. So we're looking at a test suite, which I've called Ranorex Troubleshooting Examples. And in that test suite, we have a test case. And in that test case, I have a number of recording modules. And so each one of these recording modules has a name based on the example that we'll be taking a look at. So in the first case, we have recorder actions here. And I will click on this. And what I want to do here is this is kind of emulating what a new user would be doing. A new user steps through our wizard. When they first open up Ranorex, even just for the first time, they go through our solution wizard, and it allows them to select if they want to create a desktop or a web test or a mobile test, and they go through a couple of steps and they enter either the URL that they want to test or the desktop application they want to test, and that generates a new solution for them that looks a little bit like this. And so a new user will have a recording module like this one here, which will be empty after creating the solution with the wizard. And their first action is probably going to be to press the record button here, which we're going to do right now. So let me bring up my browser here so we can have a nice clean background. Actually, there we go. And let's bring up the record feature here. So I'm going to press record. And we can see that after pressing the record button, we have our Ranorex recorder, which is running down here. And so we can see that it's recording. It has this little animation here. And the way that we can really tell that it's recording is if I start to move around in the application, we can see that Ranorex's object recognition is identifying all of these unique objects in my, in this case, my web application. The same thing would be true in a desktop application. You'd see the same kind of red boxes around all of your different elements like this. So very similar workflow between the two. And I haven't clicked on anything and I haven't typed anywhere yet. So I haven't had any actions that have been recorded. I've just been mousing around. But when I begin clicking and typing in Ranorex, what we'll see is that those actions, those clicks and those key sequences, my typing on the keyboard, those actions will start to be created here in the Ranorex recorder. So the approach to recording as a new user is to be very methodical in your clicks, in your actions that you're performing. So for example, if my first task here is to click into this input and type a name, what I want to do is I want to click and then I want to wait a second, just a second or two. And before I begin typing, I'll just allow Ranorex that second or so in order to create the action correctly, everything looking good here. And then I'll begin typing. So I'll click into here and we'll see it's about a second and we see our click action created here. And then now that my cursor's in here, what I want to do is I want to begin typing. And I'm going to type my name. And the thing to note here is that my name is a few characters long. It's 5 characters long, my first name. But if I begin typing and then I pause in the middle of typing and have to think, okay, what was that thing I was going to type, right? So I start typing and then what's the next letter? Let me think about it. There's the next letter, and then let me type the other letters. What's happened there is because I paused for more than just a couple of seconds between each couple of characters that I typed, we can see that Ranorex created 3 separate key sequences. So this might be something that you face in your recording with Ranorex, which is that if you're pausing between actions in a way that, let's say, you wanted to have a key sequence that had all the letters, all these characters in one key sequence, well then you can change this later. But the best approach here would be to, on the fly here, delete these couple of actions, right? Because this is still going to work. Ranorex is going to just have a couple of key sequence actions here. But the best case scenario would be that I delete these. And let me pause my test for a second. And I'm going to get everything back the way it was. And then I'll continue my test. We'll delete this mouse click as well because we have to do it again. But let me delete this here. So I have no actions here. And let me click in here and type my name. Now notice I didn't speed type, but I typed in a way that was methodical and consistent. And so all of the characters I typed fairly quickly. And so we have this key sequence where all of the characters are in one key sequence. So this is very helpful to know this approach because the more methodical and the more purposeful your actions, the less you'll have kind of redundant actions like we had before. Now, of course, even if we had those 3 key sequences like we did before, that's fine. We can always go and clear that up later. In fact, let's take a look at what that would look like. So imagine I'll pause my recorder here and I'll get this back to the state that I want it to be in. And I'll continue here and we'll start again from scratch. So imagine we do what we did in the first example where I click in here and I start typing and then I pause for a second, think about what's that next character? Oh, that's the next character. And then what's the next character? There we go. So all this, like I said before, will work when you go to play it back. But if we stop our recording here, we have 4 actions when really it would be best to have 2. First, we click into this input, and then we want to type the name, right? So what we can do here is we can get rid of these actions. We can just delete them. And then notice I can go in here and I can modify this to be whatever I'd like. So I can go and just change it here. So in this way, we've cleaned up our actions in our actions panel here. And this is just a much nicer and cleaner way of having our test structured. I know it's just 2 actions, but this compounds over time because later on you may have dozens of actions, many of which are split out among multiple key sequences or multiple mouse clicks. Uh, let's think of an example like that. So let's go back to recording and imagine I already have my name put in here, and we can see that we cleaned this up in our action panel, so we can see it here in our recorder, which is nice. But imagine if I weren't taking this methodical approach to clicking and typing in my application. Let's say I click here and then actually, you know what, I want to go over here to this tab and I forgot that I had to do this thing, and I come back here and oh yeah, I have to click here again and type my last name. Well, since the recorder was running this whole time, we have a whole lot of clicks that should not actually be clicks that we want to include in our test. So let's think about that. Let's stop for a second. And one of the real helpful benefits in Ranorex is that you have these screenshots that you get for every element that you click on and interact with. So let's take a look at our action panel again. So we have our first 2 actions that we created and that we cleaned up, and they look good. And then the next click here is, let's see, what am I clicking on? So we can see from the screenshot that the red box, that's what I'm clicking on. So okay, I clicked on last name. That looks good. But then over here, I'm clicking on a different tab in my browser, and I probably don't want that. That's probably not part of my test. In fact, we know it's not part of the test. This was just something that I had done kind of on the fly. So that's probably not something I want. And let's take a look at, okay, so yeah, I clicked back on the tab that I was testing on. So both of these clicks looks to me like they are clicks that I don't want. This is not really part of my test. This was just me making a mistake by clicking a couple of things outside of the scope of what my real testing was. So lucky for me, I can just press Control and click on these 2 to highlight both of them. And I'm going to right click and just delete them. So now we have these 5 actions, but it looks to me, in looking at this, so first I click on first name, and I type in my first name, and then I click on last name. It looks like these actions 3 and 4 are the same action. Because if you remember, I clicked around in here, then I clicked here, then I clicked here, then I clicked back in the last name input. So I made that action happen twice, which it doesn't need to happen twice in my test. You know, it won't fail here because if we play this back, it's going to click in first name, it's going to type the first name, it's going to click in last name, it's going to click in last name again, and then it's going to type last name. That will likely still work, but it's unnecessary to have this repeated action like this. So in the same way, I can right click on it and I can delete it. So the main takeaway from this example is that the Ranorex Recorder is a very powerful tool, and it will record every action that you perform while the recorder is running, whether they be actions that you want to record or actions that you accidentally recorded while the recorder was running. But if that happens, if you record a couple of actions by mistake, that's fine. You can either delete them on the fly, like we saw in this example where you have the trash can here, and you can use the eye here, little eye icon, to see the screenshots of each one of these actions and see, is this actually an action that I meant to perform? You know, did I accidentally click out here and then click not on the delete button, but you know, somewhere close to it? Is that really what I meant to do? So you can look at the eye and you can say, oh, well, that doesn't look like the correct place, so I can get rid of that one on the fly. Let me see here. I meant to click on the delete button, but take a look there at that screenshot. I didn't quite click on it. I clicked just to the right of it. So actually that was the wrong action. So being able to delete these actions on the fly is very helpful. So I'll stop the recorder here. And so this is just an example of recording actions and developing the eye in Ranorex to be able to see, am I clicking on the things that I meant to click on? And then when you finish the recording, are these actions actually the actions that I wanted to record? So let's go ahead and save this, and we'll move on now to our next example, which is the example of slow playback. Now, this happens in some cases, and it's typically associated with one specific issue, which is that a path for an object is not the correct path. And so, what do I mean when I say a path for an object? Well, in Ranorex, every every action is associated with an object. So, in our first example here that we looked at, we have these objects that we clicked on. Now, we didn't give these objects names ourselves. We didn't manually go and create these objects in our repository and name them first name, last name, all this. Ranorex did that for us, which is pretty neat. So when we went to record and we clicked on some elements in our web application, Ranorex created those objects and gave them names based off of certain values associated with them. Or Ranorex kind of abstracts all of that away from the user. Now, you do, as the user, have the ability to go and modify that yourself if you'd like, uh, but often you don't have to. So Ranorex created some objects for us in our repository. So let's take a look at this slow playback example. So here I've already created an action, and the action is a simple mouse click. And I use the recorder and I clicked on this input here, which is this, instead of being in the web app that we have here that we saw in the last example, this is in our desktop app. So our desktop app is a nice desktop application that gives you a lot of different types of objects and things that you can interact with to kind of get up to speed with testing with Ranorex. It's a very helpful application. Uh, but sometimes what you might find in any application really, is that when you go to record and click on some element using Ranorex, you might find that when you go to play your test back, Ranorex takes, let's say, a little bit longer than you would expect to find that element. In in a previous example, we might have seen that Ranorex would find an element in just a couple of seconds or even less. But sometimes you go to play back a test and Ranorex is taking 10, 20, 30 seconds to find the element. And finally it does find it, but when it does find it, you think to yourself, that took a lot longer than I would expect that it should have, or that took a lot longer than the other actions. Let's imagine you have 5 or 10 actions here, and each one of them is happening very quickly, and then one of them is taking 30 seconds or more to occur. So typically, what that will be, the reason for that is because of something called robust path. You finding an element using the robust path. So what does that mean? Well, let me go and run this recording, and we'll see an example of this. Give me 1 second here. I'm just going to modify our whitelist. We'll talk about this in a little bit here. So for this example, this is just for the desktop application. And so let me go and run this. Let me make sure that the app is in the correct state. This is the page this is the tab that we want to test. This is the tab that we have these two actions for. So let me run this, and I'll bring up this application here. And take a look in the bottom right-hand corner. So we're running this test, And whereas typically you would see that by now, especially after 10 seconds, we can see 10, 12, 13 seconds have elapsed. By now, Ranorex should have found this object that it's looking for, but it hasn't yet. And so we'll let it keep running. And after about 30 seconds, we're going to see some different behavior. So give it a couple more seconds and let's see what it does. Keep your eye on the application here. So we saw that Ranorex did, in fact, after about 30 seconds, move the mouse up here, click in here, and type this test, which is these are the two elements or the two actions that we have here in our actions panel. A mouse click on the enter your name element, and then a key sequence of test. So the test did play back successfully, right? Things did work as they were supposed to work. However, it took a very long time, right? It took way longer than we would think. And let's look at that here. So since we ran that recording module, we get a report back. Every time you run a test, you run your entire test suite or a test case, anything that you execute in Ranorex, you're going to get the report for that. So in our case, we were in the slow playback recording module, and I pressed the run recording button. And the test ran, and we got our report back. And this report gives us a very important tidbit of information. So take a look at this here. We have mouse left click on enter your name. So the left click worked. But here we can see that it says item enter your name was found using robust path. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that our path for our object was not the optimal path. It was kind of close, but Ranorex could not use that path to find the object. And when I say path, what I mean is that all of these objects, like we talked about before, that Ranorex is creating for us when we use the recorder, all of these objects have a path associated with them. And the path is this Ranorex path here. So every one of these objects is found by Ranorex using a path, using a Ranorex path. And Ranorex generates these paths based off of a number of different settings that we can modify if we'd like. And there's a lot of information on that subject in our user guide, which I highly recommend that everyone takes a look at. The user guide should be your resource as you're going along in your testing and getting skilled up with Ranorex. You can, of course, also reach out to us at Ranorex. You can contact us through the website, but the user guide should be your go-to resource for troubleshooting any type of issue that you may find. So let's take a look at the user guide real quick. So here we are at ranorex.com. If we go over here to resources, we can take a look at user guide under the support section. And the user guide is broken out very neatly into these different sections. So you have Ranorex Studio Fundamentals, Advanced, Expert, and then a couple of other sections that are based on specific areas like web and mobile testing, interfaces, things like integrations, some hands-on topics, a few different things. And in each one of these sections, you have a lot of subsections and their respective subsections. So there's a ton of information in here. And so what we're going to talk about just briefly, and this won't be a deep dive, but excuse me, we're going to go into the Ranorex path just a little bit to understand why it was that our test took 30 seconds to find that element, and then found it using the robust path. So the robust path, Ranorex, for each one of these elements that you create, and when I say create, really, Ranorex is creating the elements for you when you record, but they've been created by you interacting with your application. Ranorex is creating these paths for you, and for every element, there are actually two paths. There's the path that we see here, and then there's a robust path. And a robust path is kind of like Ranorex's intelligent way of being able to take the path that is the primary path that Ranorex uses, and then fall back on the robust path in case this path is not working. And that's exactly what happened in this case here. We had about, we can see here, about 32, almost 33 seconds elapse before we found the object here, and it was found using robust path. So if we want, we can change paths in Ranorex, and we can either change the path or we can change the settings that generate paths from this point on. So what I want to do is I want to do that. I want to change settings. So I can go right up here to my settings button, and I want to go here to the advanced section. And right here we have our Ranorex path settings. And so right now it's just a slider, and the slider defaults to being in the center. And since we had that error where the robust path needed to be used in order to find that element, that indicates to me that the way that Ranorex is currently generating paths for this application that I'm trying to test is not ideal. And so what I want to do is I want to move my robustness slider further to robust, which will generate robust paths from the get-go. So I want to move it, let's say I want to move it all the way to robustness, maximum robustness. And let me apply this. And then we can see here, here's our enter your name. Here's our element that took those 30 some odd seconds to find. And a keen eye might be able to detect maybe why this is the case by looking at the path, but that's for a more advanced user of Ranorex. And if you are a more beginner or intermediate level Ranorex user, that's not a problem at all. Don't fret. But what we can do is we can either delete this from our repository and go and re-record it, or we can edit it in SPY. Both ways are fine. Editing the element in SPY will require a little bit more Ranorex path knowledge. So what I want to do for now is I'm going to delete this from my repository, and I'm going to go and record. So let me press record, and I'll pause my recording for a second because I want to get a nice, as clean of a background as I can so that I can better see everything that I want to interact with. So I pause my recording. Let me bring up the application here, and let me delete this, and then I'll start my recording again, and I will click in here. So I'll click in because this is the input that I want to test. I'll click in here, and then I'll stop. So that's all I wanted to do. I just wanted to click on that element so that I could get it into my repo. And now I can use that element. So we have a couple of things that we have to do here. In the first case, because I deleted an element from my repository, that element was tied to this first action here. So we can see that there's a little error. It says, hey, you don't have a repository item for this action anymore. So that's okay. We can right click and delete that. And now we have our two actions, but they're out of order because first is our key sequence and then our click. But what we want is first to click and then our key sequence. So we can just click and drag and move stuff around. That's one of the great things in Ranorex is you can click and drag and move things. I can click from all of my different recording modules. I can drag them up into my test case. I can move things around. And this is what we really want to see. So we're back to more or less where we were before. We're doing a mouse click on this repository item. However, now this repository item, because we changed the settings for the path generation, is going to have a different path, which was created for us by Ranorex based on those settings, and all we had to do was move that slider. But now, let me play this back, and we'll take a look at the difference in the execution time. So we fire it up, and then within 2-3 seconds, our actions are working the way that we expected them to. It just took a couple of seconds, and Ranorex was able to find the element, click it, and then type in the field. So Examples like this are very helpful for newer users who may not have seen this type of thing before, but they're experiencing this kind of delay on some of their items. And the delay is associated typically with a suboptimal path that's been generated by Ranorex. But the great thing is that in many cases, you don't need to have that advanced level Ranorex knowledge yet. All you need to do is to go into the settings and modify your slider just a little bit. Settings, advanced, and just move this slider around a little bit and see if you can re-record a couple of elements and see if those elements don't work a little better or a little bit more robustly, where Ranorex is able to find them and interact with those elements in your application. So no need at that point to go in and learn all of the Ranorex path modification and stuff yet. That's something that you will likely not have to do unless you're in a very advanced use case. In many cases, you can achieve the robustness that you're looking for in your testing just by moving the robustness slider. So there's an example of troubleshooting slow playback. Let's see an example of a failing test. So sometimes you might have a test. Let's say you've recorded several actions and your test always seems to fail at one particular point, right? It seems to fail on one action in particular. So let's take a look at an example of this. Let's see in our demo application we have this object identification tab, and in the object identification tab there are a lot of buttons here. And so all of these buttons are uniquely identifiable by Ranorex based on some value that they have, right? There are how many buttons in here that say button one? There's button one, button one, button one. There's so many of them, right? But Ranorex is able to distinguish this button one from this button one or any other button one based off of something about it that's unique. And that thing about it that's unique, there may be several things about it that are unique. So let me go and try to run this recording here. I'm going to play this because I already recorded these actions, and all these were is we can see from our screenshots. We don't even need to play it to see what I did here. Let's take a look at our screenshots. First, I click on this button, then that button, then this button, then that button, then another button. So I just click on a few buttons in a row. And so let me run this, and let's see how it works here. So bring this up, take my hands off the mouse here, click, click, click. And then at a certain point here, we can see that Ranorex, if we look in the bottom right-hand corner, says searching for button 6. So in the same way as before, where we had that slow object recognition, Ranorex here is searching, searching, searching. And it has a certain amount of time that it's going to search for this element, right? In this case, it looks like 1.5 minutes total. So it's gone about 30 seconds now, and it's just going to keep going and going and search for that object. And what I know here from creating this example is that it's not going to find it. And so the test it's going to go all the way through that minute and a half, those 90 seconds, and then the test is going to fail, and we're going to get that error in our report. So instead of sitting through the 90 seconds here, I'm just going to press the pause key, and I'm going to stop the test. But so this may be something that you encounter in your testing, that you've created a test, and every time you go to play it back, things work great up to one certain point, and then the test always seems to fail at that one certain point. So how do we troubleshoot that? Well, let's take a look at our report, and then let's take a look back at our recording module. So it looks to me like we have a couple of logging lines here that everything worked successfully. We had Ranorex clicked on this button 3, button 4, button 5, and these are the names, again, that Ranorex has assigned to these buttons when I clicked on them and recorded my test here. I know that all the buttons have the text value of button 1 inside of them, but notice how Ranorex assigned these button 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to them. And if we even take a look in our paths here, we can see that we have this automation ID button 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So what that tells me is that Ranorex's identifying these buttons based off of something other than just the text of button 1 or button 2, the text inside of the button. There's something going on behind the scenes that Ranorex is using to identify these buttons. And in this case, we can see that it's because all of these buttons have an automation ID of some value, button 3, 4, 5, 6, and that depends on how the developers of the application that you're trying to test, how they developed, how they wrote the code to for those buttons or for those elements, right? So in our case here, just by taking a brief look here, we can see that, well, all these buttons have an automation ID, which is just a unique ID that lets those buttons be uniquely identifiable. So button 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all this, that's how those buttons are actually identified, not by the text necessarily that's inside of the buttons. And Ranorex is using that to its advantage. However, Ranorex is failing on one of these actions, which is this button 6 here. So we can see that in our report, we have button 3, 4, 5, and then 6 is where it got stuck and was searching and searching and searching, and then I aborted the test myself. So okay, so that gives us a clue. Button 6 is a button that that's an element that we need to go take a look at. So let me come back here to my repository, and I can see that we have all these button 5, 6, 7, all these. Let's take a look at button 6 and take a look at the paths for each one of these buttons. Now, all these paths look very similar. Button automation ID and then its value button 4. Same thing here, button automation ID button 3, button automation ID button 7, and then here we have something else. Now what's going on here? We have this container first. So there's a container and some indexed value, and then button automation ID button 6. So how come this button's path doesn't look the same as all these other buttons' paths? Well, maybe it was the way that Ranorex generated the path. Maybe it was because I had my settings for my path generation on some other part of the slider here at that point, and then I went and changed them later, and so the other paths afterwards were generated in a different way. Could have been a number of things, but in trying to troubleshoot this, I could think to myself, well, this path looks a little fishy because all these other paths look almost identical, with the exception of their button ID value that changes, and this one has this extra container here. So maybe one way that I could play with this is I could just try and make this path look like my other paths here. And I realize here that we're modifying the Ranorex path, and there are some topics that you'll want to go through as you learn to modify the Ranorex path, and that's where the user guide really comes in handy. So if we're in the user guide, we can see that here in the advanced section, there's an entire section on the Ranorex path. Introduction, basics, examples, syntax, all this stuff. So you can, if you find yourself in a situation where you need to modify the path a little bit, go ahead and check out the user guide, go to the Ranorex path section, take a look at all the different examples that we have here. There are a lot of good examples. It's really good documentation on the subject. So okay, so I went and I made this path look very similar to my other paths here for these different buttons. And I want to test this out. So let me go back here and just get everything back to the way that I want it, the right state. And let me run this test. So whereas before we saw that our test was always failing at that one point, now let's take a look. 2, 3, 4, 5. Everything worked. The tricky action that was failing before is now working, and the actions after it have been able to be performed as well. So we had our test work successfully. We can see we have our success message here, all of our logging. It looks like everything worked great. So, okay, that is an example of how to troubleshoot a failing test. If a test is failing at one particular area on one particular action or a couple of actions, it's typically something associated with the Ranorex path. So if you're newer to the Ranorex path, like I had mentioned before, go and check out the Ranorex path section on our website. See if you can't go through a couple of examples and try and troubleshoot maybe what the path is in your repository that Ranorex has generated that might be not the optimal path and that you might have to tweak a little bit. So in the final example here, we have a mouse click. I called this mouse click error, but what it really is about is clicking on the wrong element. So let's think of an example of this. Let's say in our application here, how would we close this application? Well, it looks like we have this exit button, which I believe closes the application, but we also have this X button here, right? And if I hover on it, we can see that we have that little close value there. So we know that this is a close button, but this button here, although the inner text is, or the text value is exit, what if this button also said close instead of exit? So you would have two buttons and they were both technically close buttons. Now I know this is an exit button and this is a close button, but what if they both contained that value of close? Well, that might present a confusing problem for Ranorex because you have two elements, and although they look to the human eye very different, they might be, based off of how Ranorex finds these elements, they might be very similar. So actually, let's take a look at this. I'm going to open up our spy tool, and I realize we haven't taken a look at the spy tool yet, and we're gonna use it now. And just for the newer users who have not seen the spy tool yet, again, there's a great section on our website in the user guide on the Ranorex spy tool. Here it is in the Ranorex spy section, all about how to use the spy tool, how to modify paths, how to find elements, lots of really great information in there. So definitely check that out. But so what I want to do is I want to use the spy tool and I want to press the track button here. So I'm going to track and the spy tool minimized itself, and this is not what I want to track, right? I don't want to track our PowerPoint presentation. So what I can do is on my keyboard, I can press and hold the F12 key, which you saw got rid of that red bounding box. And I'm holding the F12 key. And what I want to do really is I want to get my application up here. And now I'm releasing the F12 key. And so I can track where I want to track. So it's a nice helpful tidbit, a nice helpful tip to know, because when we fire up the tracking in the spy tool, we want to track the correct thing. And so what if my application is not up? It's minimized. I need to bring it up first, but I already pressed the track button. I can press and hold F12 and I can bring it up the way I need to. Then release F12 and then I can interact with the application that I want to interact with. So let's take a look at that example. So in the same way as when we were using the recorder, we could see that we had our red bounding boxes around everything that we were trying to record. And the spy tool does something similar, which it's using those red bounding boxes, but instead of recording actions, it's just helping me, quote, spy on those elements in my application to learn more about them. So let me hover over this close button, and I don't even need to click it yet. I'm going to click it in a second. But I'm going to hover over this, and we can see a lot of information about this element just by hovering over it. So at the very top, we look, it says button close, roll button, a whole lot of information here. But so this button is the close button. And then if I come down here and hover here, look at the very top, it says button, RX button exit. Okay. So let me track this one first. And so I can see that I have a close button. And I can see that from my path up here, a button with the text value of close. Now we don't see, as the users, as the human users, to the human eye, we don't see any text value anywhere. We see an X, right? But there is a text value associated with this button, and it's close. Now, what happens if I go to track this exit button? See a very similar path up here, and I can see that the button has a text value of exit. So similar to close, but in this case, exit. But if this button's text said close inside of it, then that might be a confusing case for Ranorex because Ranorex says, hey, wait a minute, there are two buttons in my application that both have a text value of close. How do I distinguish between those two buttons? Well, luckily, a lot of that is abstracted away from you as the user and taken care of by Ranorex because Ranorex will find the best possible path for that button. So take a look here. We have inside of our form, which is our application that we're testing, we have our form/button. So one layer down from our form, we have this button. Whereas here, if I click on this, inside of our application, which is our form, our whole application, we go down a couple of layers. So the first button was here. The other button is here in this tree of elements that we have for this application. So now instead of form/button, we can see it's form/?/question mark button. And that's just Ranorex handling the fact that there are a couple of layers between form and button, as we can see here. Form goes down to title bar and then to button. So Ranorex is handling this for us, even if both of those elements had the text value of close, Ranorex would be able to distinguish between the two of them. But if you find that they both did have the value of close, and Ranorex is accidentally clicking on this one instead of this one, or this one instead of this one, then you can take a look at the Ranorex path yourself and reference our Ranorex path section in our user guide and see if you can't find a couple of tips and tricks as to how to really robustly distinguish between those two things, those two elements. So typically it's something associated with the element itself, right? Either a text value or an attribute value, and all that is explained in our Ranorex Spy and Ranorex Path sections on our user guide. So please check those out, give those a look, and walk through some of the examples there and see if they aren't similar to the examples that you're seeing in your specific use case that where you might be encountering an issue with the object recognition in Ranorex. So more than anything, these have been a couple examples that I see when helping new users or newer users troubleshoot some issues that they've been facing with their testing. And I see these issues fairly often in the earlier stages of testing with Ranorex because a newer user is not aware of these tips, not aware of the fact that they can go and modify the Ranorex path, or that they can go and modify the actions they've already created and move things around. Or while recording, they can delete actions on the fly. You have a lot of flexibility as a user in Ranorex. And the more familiar you become with the tool, the more you'll realize that you can modify just about anything and get some great results in the process. So the Ranorex user guide will be your best resource along the way. Now, of course, you can also reach out to us. You can reach out to our support team. You can check with us to see if we can help. If there's a very specific case that you're not finding that's not being addressed in the user guide, please reach out, contact us, and talk with us about that scenario. But in many cases, the Ranorex user guide can help you out with those issues that you may be facing. So this has been a discussion of a few of the common issues that newer users will face, and I hope these examples were very valuable and helpful in your discovery journey with Ranorex as you get started and skilled up with the tool. And so I will go ahead and end here, but please feel free to reach out. You can contact us through the website. If you go to Ranorex and resources, you can contact us, or I'm sorry, through the products tab here, Ranorex Studio. You can contact sales, you can contact support, and we will be happy to get back to you and talk with you about your specific case. If you have not downloaded the free trial of Ranorex yet, Right here on the website, you can try Studio. Go ahead and try Ranorex Studio and contact us. We're happy to have a screen sharing call and help you troubleshoot your solution during that 2-week free trial period. So uh, don't be shy and don't hesitate to reach out. But anyway, uh, again, my name is Aaron, and I am happy to assist you all as you are going down your Ranorex journey. Thanks again, and we hope to hear from you soon.